Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, Labor revives WorkChoices in a bid to resuscitate itself. The matriarch of the Murdoch family backs a price on carbon. And will male diggers accept women in frontline roles? Our panel tonight, contributing editor with Newsweek magazine, Julia Baird, Greens Senator-elect Lee Rhiannon, and also political author Phil Senior. Well, Tony Abbott famously declared WorkChoices was dead, buried and cremated during last year's federal election campaign. But it wasn't dead, buried and cremated in question time today. As Labor struggles to sell the carbon tax to voters, government MPs were trying to raise the spectre of the coalition's IR policy.
The Liberal Party has never believed in protecting Australian jobs. You cannot have concern about job security and be a supporter of WorkChoices.
Why did the government overturn WorkChoices? What risks are there of a return to WorkChoices? And why is it important to protect the rights of Australians at work?
Nothing is more fundamental to those of us on this side of the House than supporting jobs. Mr Speaker.
The most important thing we did on coming to office was to abolish WorkChoices.
Phil, why is a government that's been in power for 4 years asking itself questions about a government that was previously in power?
Look, it reeks of desperation, doesn't it? I mean, I think what you're seeing here is on the back of several days' polling that suggests that if there were an election held any time soon, this government would be annihilated. On the back of that, they're desperate. And so I think for the Labor Party for a few weeks now, it's been pretty apparent that in case of emergency, break glass and beat the WorkChoices drum. I mean, that's what happens every time this government is under pressure. Rather than defend its own policies or try and move the agenda to something positive, it brings up a WorkChoices scare campaign. And I think people are pretty much able to see straight through that.
We do know, though, it's in the DNA of the Liberal Party to want to have workplace reform. Is there any inkling that they may go back to some kind of IR reform before the next election even?
There's certainly a debate going on in the party. I think whatever the outcome of that, the idea that they will go to the election with anything that remotely resembles WorkChoices, I think is fantasy land. No one in the senior echelons of the party would let that happen. I think there is definitely a debate, though, about to what extent they do need to talk about and put forward a proposal that tackles some of the issues that have been seen with Fair Work Australia since it came in. I mean, my personal view as a point of strategy, I think they need to talk about this issue as little as possible, because whilst at the moment the government looks desperate talking about WorkChoices, when the opposition's not pushing this issue at all, inevitably, as soon as they do start to talk about IR reform, it will give the government something to work with, and I just think they don't need to do that.
If federal Labor was going to go down this track today, though, all they had to do was talk about New South Wales, because the legislation that's come through in New South Wales, some people are calling it no choices, because it is in many ways worse than WorkChoices, because we don't even have an independent umpire. We don't have a Industrial Relations Commission that is useful, that can be referred to, and now the decision on wages rests with the Ministry in New South Wales.
Well, they did briefly raise that, Lee, but I'm wondering what you think about the government obsessing with the opposition and Tony Abbott all the time. Why aren't they out there selling their own policies?
Oh, look, you've really nailed it. There is a failure with the government at the moment, and we've seen it on many issues. The standout was a year ago when they were grappling with the mining resources tax, which really could have been explained to people quite easily. I mean, Australians aren't keen on big overseas mining multinational companies. I think to be a little bit fair to them with the price on carbon, they're sort of in a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand you need to be able to have time to get down to the detail, and everybody wants an answer immediately. So there is a bit of balance that needs to be done there, but all along I think they need to explain what they're doing, and they do fail to do that.
And Julia, the price on carbon dominated question time today. Yesterday the opposition was asking questions about asylum seekers. Today it was all about the carbon tax. They seem to keep wanting to talk about the carbon tax.
And you would, wouldn't you, if you were the coalition? I mean, it's framed in such a negative way. At the moment, it's looking bureaucratic, administrative, difficult to understand, difficult to translate, as Lee is saying. In any way, it just doesn't get across that this could be a positive thing, that this is something you might want to enact as a society when you're in a time of prosperity, when you can afford to. It is almost completely dropped off the agenda in the US, for example. And I think what's really interesting is when you look at the carbon tax debate and what Australia is doing, and you look at the history of how we've thought about climate change and the history of denial, and that's gone from it's not happening at all, any climate change or any global warming, to, OK, it's happening but humans aren't responsible for it, to, OK, it's happening and humans are responsible but it's too expensive and we can't do anything about it. That's pretty much where the debate is globally. And Australia is being innovative and is at the forefront of that and trying to kind of look at it. But when you come back to the country, it's very much bogged in negativity. So, of course, the coalition's going to jump on it.
Well, the push for a carbon tax is being blamed for Labor's latest poll showing in the polls. A news poll puts Julia Gillard's personal approval rating at 30%, her lowest yet, with 5 points lost in just a couple of weeks. Victorian Labor backbencher Kelvin Thompson conceded the party stocks are down.
It's fair to say that Labor's support has fallen over the course of the past couple of years. I've said before and I'll say it again, I think that governments that run high population growth policies make it hard for themselves.
And while the coalition was way ahead on the two-party preferred vote, the news wasn't all good for Tony Abbott. The number of people unhappy with his leadership outnumbered those who think he's doing a good job. But that didn't faze his Liberal frontbench colleagues.
There has been a general trend of a substantial increase for Tony, which I think warms the hearts of most coalitionists, that the more people get to know and see Tony Abbott, the higher his ratings go.
Julia, if you're going to have a series of diabolical polls, it's better to have them 2 years out from an election than 6 months out. Can the government turn it around this far?
Of course.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly distracting, especially when you're about to bring in some really fundamental legislation, to continue to keep turning back to the polls. And Obama found exactly the same thing. I mean, he was polling incredibly poorly at the end of last year, with the recession, with the unemployment, with what was happening on Wall Street and how badly the bailout had been handled, with the perception and, again, the selling of healthcare. But then suddenly he turned it all around in a matter of a few weeks over Christmas. And in fact 2 weeks, when he got through an agenda which was don't ask, don't tell, and energy reform and so on. And now, of course, he's tracked down bin Laden. Things can turn around very quickly. And I think what you've got to do is show conviction and show authority and so show that you can make the difficult decisions. I mean, that's what's going to come round in the end. And that's what will translate into polls.
And Phil, you really can pinpoint this to the carbon tax.